Trustees will function as Christian stewards of property God has entrusted to the congregation. However, the role and responsibilities of this team represent so much more than fixing things in the church. It's important to learn how this team's work impacts hospitality and requires strong fiduciary responsibility. Additionally, annual and long-term strategic planning will be discussed. In an hour? No wonder we needed to start ahead of time. That's a lot that's there. I'm not sure that we can do all of that, but we can touch on all of those things. Regardless of what Ann said, let me tell you why, at least I think that I'm here. If it means that you listen, then great. As she said, my name is Rodney Frieden. I'm the senior pastor at Epworth United Methodist Church in Indianapolis on the northeast side. I also happen to be a member of the conference's finance and administration team. I've been part for the last 10 years of both Bishop Coiner and Bishop Trimble looking at stewardship and tithing in the Indiana Conference. And so if you've been connected to any of those writings and things that have been published, I've been a large part of those teams that's been publishing that. My last two churches, this one and the one previous, have transitioned to single board structures. And so I've been involved with what that looks like to go from a single board away from multiple committees in two different. But I also have to be a former business owner. Business owner that was a multi-million-dollar corporation that had over 100 employees. I've been part of doing work with nonprofits, including having been the initiator of creating a couple of nonprofits. I've been part of building projects at churches, and as well as just church improvement projects that were of larger scale. You know, there's always projects that you'd like to get done, but just kind of hang around, and have been a part of those. I think that in part that's why John and Ann said, come talk to our group of trustees. That's why I think that I'm here. Conversations thrown at them. Right? I mean, you have the difficult task of, you have meetings that talk about buildings that are old, that have problems with them. When it comes to doing the work or the repairs or the maintenance or the upkeep, there's never enough people. Therefore, no one ever wants to be a trustee, right? The cost of upkeeping the building keeps going up. No matter what you do, you won't be able to please everyone. Am I touching on some subjects here? And so, with that, I want to acknowledge that each of you brings unique problems to the table this morning, and as time allows at the end, we'll try and address those specific concerns. And if we don't have, as Ann already alluded to, you can have my email, you can have my contact, you can have my cell phone number. I'm open to having those kinds of conversations to help you try and navigate through some of those concerns. The reality of it is, I think the reason I'm here today is because at my heart, while I'm a pastor, I'm an educator. And as education transitions into this matters of faith, I have a unique personal philosophy, and that is that faith matters. But faith matters to what we do every day. Faith isn't something that matters because it gives us a ticket to heaven. Faith matters because it matters what we do right now, and then we're promised that what we do right now will matter forever. And so the work of the trustees then is work that's really important. So in a sprint, yeah, it's going to be a sprint. We're going to take a look at what is a trustee, what is the role of a trustee, what are the primary tasks of a trustee, and what does it mean to be called to the larger roles, which were some big words, fiduciary and hospitality. So that's kind of the roadmap of where we're going to go. Within that, I'm going to talk about 5 big shifts in how we approach the role. So you don't have they're written right here. The definition of a trustee and the 5 shifts. That's a handout. When we get to this, I'm going to hand you this. These are sample tasks. This is an outline for you on that. But before we get there, when we talk about what a trustee is, generally speaking, a church trustee is a layperson who takes care of the secular business of running a church. In other words, the trustee is actually tasked with managing finances and property and ensuring that the church is compliant with any legal requirements. Now notice that in that definition, it didn't say anywhere that the trustee was responsible for fixing plumbing leaks or changing light bulbs. Now, here's the difficulty. The position of a trustee is not biblically mandated. So you're not going to be able to go open your Bible and find where it is. You're going to have to dig a little bit. The practical part of being a trustee is that it aids with the appropriation, the maintenance, and the disposition of church property. So it has that legal piece. And although the trustees aren't mentioned in the Bible, their role is biblical in nature. The New Testament calls us to be stewards. 1 Peter 4:10 says, as each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of God's grace. That applies to the church as well as it does to anything that you do in your family and in your personal life. Acts chapter 2 described the early church. Remember that? It said that they continually devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. We usually stop there, but 44, 45, and 46 says that they believed together. And then we had this problem because it says that they held everything in common. And if there was a need, they sold something to take care of everybody's needs. And we have a whole bunch of people in the last 100 years that have run off and gone communal, sold all their property and lived together because they thought that that's what it meant. I think what it says is that we took care of one another and we shared the stuff that we had in common. Isn't that the church? Who owns, well, you've probably been there. Who supposedly owns the piano, right? It's owned communally by the church for everyone's benefit. Just don't tell so-and-so who thinks that, yeah, okay, that's how we acknowledge that, just so we can be rooted in reality. But if we look at the early church, the apostles very quickly figured out that they couldn't do everything. And that the need to help everyone that was part of that early church was just logistically impossible. So in Acts chapter 6, just a few chapters later, they met and elected deacons. And what I would tell you is that the deacons sort of waited on tables so that the apostles could do the ministry of the word. And the concept there is that the deacons in their work in the early church, all the way back to Acts, sets the table for what trustees do in today's world. In other words, what I would say is the pastor shouldn't have to worry about whether or not a light bulb has changed or whether the church is meeting all of its legal requirements or the property is being maintained and upkept, because if they're having to worry about that, they can't do the ministry of the word. And so there's a big partnership with what the trustees do. But the Bible doesn't give us any specific instructions regarding buildings and equipment. It would be nice if it did, but it doesn't. And the reason that it doesn't is because the early church met in public spaces, personal homes, and in community-owned lecture halls. They didn't have a church. The first known church facility didn't exist until AD 240. So it's AD 240 before the first church building exists. And maybe our churches should take a lesson from that first church, because it was gone and destroyed by 256. It had a 16-year lifespan. In the early 400s, so almost 200 years after that, what we now know as the Roman Catholic Church, but the church, because that's us in the early 400s, developed a role for trustees to manage and have legal authority over the church building. So the role that you play in has a 1600-year history that ties back to the 400s, but it actually ties back to the first deacons in terms of their partnership in ministry. Here's where it splits. Deacons met the needs of people. Trustees meet the needs of property. But here's the important thing to remember. It's not just any property that they manage. Right? What kind of property is it that you manage? Church property. And not only that, I'd go a step further. You're a trustee of a United Methodist church property. So within that concept, there is some other implication. And that implication is that if you're going to be a trustee of a United Methodist church property, then you must be identified as a servant leader or a follower of Jesus that could be put in that role. All right, so I'm making a leap. That's the assumption I'm making. And the assumption then is, as a servant leader, that your work is designed to open ways for God to work through you. So Brad, you're a trustee, so that someone else said you could be on that board of trustees, because I believe if you're on that trustee board, God's going to work through you to accomplish what? The work of God. The work of your church, that ministry. And so I think we have to take a step back if we're going to talk about what our role is as trustees, to understand that we have a greater role in the church. And that greater role comes from the book of discipline. You didn't imagine that. Here's the good news. This may be the only time you've ever heard the book of discipline brought up in a meeting where you went, I could agree with that. Thank you for sharing that. Did you know that the book of discipline actually spells out the mission and work that the church is supposed to do? It says that we're to make disciples for the transformation of the world. But it goes even further than that. It lays out what transformation looks like. Paragraph 122 of the book of discipline says that transformation takes place when we, one, reach out and receive people into the body of Christ. Not into your church, not into the United Methodist Church, but into the body of Christ. Second, we help people relate to Christ through their gifts and the circumstances that they are in. Third, we nurture and strengthen people in their relationship with God and with other people. Four, we send those transformed people out into the world to lead lives that have been transformed. And then finally, because we might have forgotten, we continue to do what? Reach, help, nurture, and send. And it is an ongoing cycle that we're invited into. And the book of discipline reminds us that every ministry area of the church is engaged in this cycle of transformation. It doesn't matter what group you're in, what committee you're on. It doesn't matter whether it's finance or missions, trustees or hospitality. You fill it in anywhere. Everything that we do, cycle it back, everything that we do is about the mission and purpose of the church, including the trustees. So the question we have to ask in our work is, especially I think as trustees, is the work that we're doing moving us as trustees, and is it moving others, as in the church and the community, towards or away from God? That's kind of a scary question to ask, right? Especially when the debate at the table is about whether we should use blue paint or green paint. But if we stopped and asked the question as we're having this conversation, is this moving us closer in relationship to God, or is it moving us further away? Because that's the work that we're in. And the primary purpose of the church building, the facilities, and everything that's in that is to enable the ministry and vision of the church and its congregation to move forward. So good stewardship, common sense, prudent action dictate that the church and their trustees take a look at the parsonage, the facilities, the property, the equipment, and the furnishings, and that they're all well maintained. So here's that first shift. We have to understand that buildings and facilities are tools in ministry, and that an attractive, welcoming, hospitable place is one that's well cared for and taken care of and maintained and kept up to date. We honor God when we care for what's been entrusted to us. But here's the fine line that we walk. We have to be careful that the property that we're entrusted to care for doesn't become an item of worship.
Amen.
Because, I mean, can I take you back to Vacation Bible School when we were all little kids? Right? The church and the steeple. But the church isn't the building. It's the people. But here's the problem. And as trustees, you have to lead that shift. Because by and large, the people that are in your congregations view your building as the church. Your job as a trustee isn't to just take care of the building, but it's also to take care of the people, because this really is the church. This is the church. But the problem is we get so caught up in the building that we end up worshiping it instead of seeing it as a tool. We would have no problem at all discarding something that is of no longer any value to us in ministry. But we look at our buildings and go, oh no, this is the building we've had for 50 years, for 60 years, for 100 years. And so you understand, I've been in a church that's in a location for getting ready to have their 175th anniversary, another that just had their 125th, and one that this year's having its 60th. All of them have problems with their building. Doesn't matter how old it gets. But we equate place with church rather than seeing it as a tool, right? Somebody has to see that tool, because if you've been up in this worship space, right, that doesn't look anything like a church looked like 100 years ago. It doesn't even look like a church did 25 years ago. How do we do that? Here's that second big shift then. Trustees don't have to have the skills in order to do the maintenance and build the church. As a matter of fact, I make the argument that some of the best trustees don't even know the difference between a hammer and a set of pliers. But that's not how we recruit trustees, right? Ooh, he's a plumber, he should be a trustee. Ooh, that's a carpenter, he should be a trustee. And we look at it that way. And while a trustee has been entrusted to see that the building is kept up as a way to honor God and to facilitate the ministries of the church, this is the church. So you need people that understand this is the church and then can do the work of the trustees taking care of this. So let me take you a step away from church trustee thought, and let's look at what we, in many cases, better understand, and that is corporate America. To start with is to equate a trustee in the church to a corporate board of directors. That's the best legal, if we're purely looking at it in terms of how the courts would look at it. When you're a trustee, you're the equivalent of a member of the board of directors. And a board of directors is a body of people that were elected or appointed who oversee the activity of a company. Their duties are outlined by corporate bylaws. So your duties are outlined by the corporate bylaws. That's called the Book of Discipline. And their main responsibility is on behalf of the shareholders. So who's the board of directors answer to? The people that own the company. Corporate boards are not responsible for day-to-day decisions. The daily decisions are made by the executives that run the company. So a board of directors sets policy so that the president can engage that goes all the way down the structure to whatever that organization is. Corporate officers, executives, employees are responsible for running the business. Some people like to think of it this way. They talk about a board of directors as like an airline pilot at 30,000 feet. They have that big picture view, overseeing everything, and the executives are at 1,000 feet, and the employees are on the ground. having been in corporate America, that's the most flawed view of what the board of directors is. Because I got news for you, board of directors don't fly planes, they fly on them. As a matter of fact, you know, if we were to equate it to the airline industry, the board of directors sets policy, but none of them is the one you want serving your Coke or flying the plane or running air traffic control. But the problem is when we take all of that, we end up trying to do that with the work of the trustees in the church. We think that the role of the trustees is to do everything. And instead, the trustees are given this responsibility to set policy and make sure that policy is maintained so that everything else takes place. So trustees' work goes farther than any of those analogies as it relates to a corporate board of directors. Because trustees have this really big responsibility that has a huge legal description. Trustees have a fiduciary obligation. They have a fiduciary role. That is, by definition, a legal obligation of one party to act in the best interest of others. You have the responsibility to act in the best interest of all of these people. Good luck, right? But your job is to act in the best interest of all of them. Not one of them, not a handful of them, but to act in the best interest of all of them. And that obligated party, the trustee, is given a fiduciary role. That means that they're entrusted with the money or property and how it's handled and what's done with it. That's called the obligation. So you have a fiduciary role, and in that role you have an obligation to act in the best interest of others. So here's the next big shift. That means that the trustee is not a janitor or a custodian. They're a steward. They're given the responsibility to care for something that doesn't belong to them. You're given the responsibility as a trustee to care for all of the property, including this, and it's your responsibility. That doesn't mean that you won't have to occasionally been entrusted with. What's the most important part that we've been entrusted with? What is the church? It's the people. Maybe as trustees we haven't forgotten that, but the people that we've been entrusted the care of have. Because they all think that it's your job to change the toilet paper and make sure that it goes over, not under, within that. So your role is as a trustee with a fiduciary obligation, and that obligation is outlined in the Book of Discipline. And I'm going to give you a handout that's going to, and we'll talk about that. But we also have a servant leader role that moves us to have to consider what is our role as a trustee in the ministry of the church. And that's that other shift. So now we're on to another shift, and that shift is that as a trustee, I believe that the primary role that we play as servant leaders is in hospitality. Trustees have a primary role in radical hospitality, and that hospitality, no matter who wants to take control of it, is going to be rooted or uprooted by the work of the trustees. Because the trustees have to do long-term planning. They have to be concerned not just with now, but also with later. And we hear this whole thing, trustees need to do access. They need to be worried about accessibility, right? So what's the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about accessibility? Which is? Tell me, I heard ADA, which means you need to be looking at what?
Ramps, bars, wide doors.
Right? Did you know that there's also people that are disabled, that are hard of hearing, that have a hard time seeing, that don't, I would make this argument. Did you know millennials are disabled?
Yes.
Because their primary way of learning is visual. And if the only thing you're doing is saying open up the hymnal and you're not providing video, in other words, if you're still using overhead projectors, do you know what anybody under the age of 35 thinks you are?
Archaic.
Archaic and a dinosaur. You are not providing access in that. It's also about sound, right? What does the sound, because that's not just about an older generation that needs to be able to hear, but that's also about a younger generation that expects the volume to be where? Up. So how do you manage that? And if your system in your church still looks like this, you've got difficulty with providing access when you'll say things like, we need younger people in the church. Except for when I look around, everything in our building screams, we don't want you here. That's accessibility. It's not just ramps and handicap. It's not just elevators. It's that and. And then I'll share this with you because you've got to be really careful with this. I'm a pastor, okay? Churches are exempt from ADA. Now, that being said, do you know any church that doesn't want to make themselves accessible to everyone? But see, we've got this idea that, the reality of it is we've got buildings that you can't even make compliant with ADA. No matter what you do, they will not be compliant. I would hazard a guess that about 85 to 90% of the churches in the Indiana Conference, even with what they've done, are not compliant with current ADA as it relates to bathrooms. But it didn't mean that we didn't try, because we want to make it hospitable to everyone. But we have, in our role as trustees, run so hard at trying to make our buildings compliant for a wheelchair or a walker or any of that, that we've forgotten that there's a group of people that we've completely left out because we have forgotten about signage, what we can see with our eyes, what we can hear with our ears, and we've delivered a whole nother message in hospitality. So there's also this notion of upkeep, right? Keeping things there. And the way I describe upkeep in a church building for trustees is this. You realize that Lucky Charms is still Lucky Charms, right? I mean, it really hasn't changed. I mean, I'm an old dude now. I'm 53, and I've been eating Lucky Charms since I was a little kid. And I still, every now and then, I have to go get me a box of Lucky Charms, and I believe a box is equal to one serving. Half a gallon of milk, large salad bowl, and a box of Lucky Charms, and that is a good dinner, right? But if you go down and you watch TV or watch the cereal aisle as you shop, do you know that Lucky Charms is new and improved about every quarter? New and improved with magical, delicious unicorn rainbow marshmallows. They haven't changed a thing. That marshmallow tastes the same as it did when it was a moon and when it was a shamrock. It's just a different shape and a different color. It doesn't have a different taste. It tastes the same. But there is the presence that someone says, ooh, I want to try those Lucky Charms. But by and large, what we do at the churches is we go, no, we don't need to do any of that. And we forget that in the role of hospitality, creating new and improved Lucky Charms with snow cones and marshmallows and unicorns is a way to be attractional for the church. And it's not just that attractional piece, but your people that you're responsible for will get excited about that. And when they get excited, you know what they do? They tell other people about what's happening at their church, and they want to bring their friends to share with them what's happened. And renewal takes place, and everyone goes, I don't know what those trustees are doing, but they ought to keep it up, because this is awesome. And you're like, oh, no, we don't do anything. Right? We just created magically delicious rainbow unicorn marshmallows. That's all that it takes. In terms of that. But within that, there are basic responsibilities. So that you take one of those. And the Book of Discipline is there to help us understand what the basic responsibilities of the trustees are. And I think the biggest lesson I ever learned in relationship to the Book of Discipline is this. The Book of Discipline is a book that helps you say no when you need to say no. The rest of the time, the Book of Discipline will help you say yes when you need to get something done. Because it will give you the model that says, according to the Book of Discipline, we need to go through these steps. And everyone, well, if the Book of Discipline says that, then it must be okay. The rest of the time, Brad, you don't have to say no. You know what? I really love the plan, but according to the Book of Discipline, we can't do that. Oh, I hate that Book of Discipline. Do you see that? The Book of Discipline is a book that provides parameters for us to keep us from getting off track. The rest of the time, the Book of Discipline just says, go. We're going to give you permission to go get this done. It's learning how to read the book. So this first page, if you got the side up that says basic responsibilities. And they're not really hard. Oversee, maintain, and supervise the local church property. Now the problem is we get caught up in the word maintain, thinking that means that we're the ones that have to do it all. But we forget to oversee and supervise. That means somebody else can cut the lawn and you can sit there and pretend like you are working for the DOT, right? Lean on a shovel and watch. You report to your charge conference. So if you remember when you go to the charge conference, there's always that language that says, did you do this and what did you do? You're supposed to report on the church's property, the equipment, their investments, and the resources that are there. That's your role and responsibility to be able to look out for those types of things and to report it. You're to receive and administer gifts made to the congregation, especially trust gifts or estate gifts. So if gifts are coming into the church because it's an estate, it's your responsibility to make sure that those are being properly used. And too often what's happened with the trustees, who do we think has that responsibility?
Stewardship.
Stewardship or finance. And the reality of it is, stewardship and finance, if you read the Book of Discipline, is responsible for balancing the checkbook and making sure a check is written. That's it.
So we're having that discussion in our church right now.
They are to compile the budget. They're not to set the budget. But that becomes a bigger ad council, because now you got to get the shift in the council to understand that. Everybody has to work together. It's the reason why Jesus said specifically to the Methodist church, you should love one another. Finance, you should love the ad council. Trustees, you should love your finance committee. But we don't do that well, right? We don't model that. If you skip down, there's some other things that are in here. Ensuring the articles of incorporation. How many of you are incorporated? Let me ask you the other way. How many are not incorporated?
How many don't know?
If you don't know, that's scary because you're a trustee, right? But yeah. So that's a question to ask. Here's what I tell you. The incorporation process is really easy. The work of incorporation is maintaining the records that show that you're acting as a corporation. The courts have said, here's where that's come down. If you have incorporated yourself simply to protect yourself, but don't act like a corporation the other 364 days out of the year, the courts do not look friendly upon that and have actually made individuals to be responsible. Guess who is responsible in your church if you are not incorporated?
Chair of trustees.
Incorrect. Anyone that is on your membership record is now an associated member and can be sued.
See, my first training said that
Now,
chair was the first person to go to.
no, if the church were to be sued and it's not incorporated, they can sue every individual that is a member of the corporation because they are considered an association by membership.
Okay. And so if you are
And
incorporated,
if you're not incorporated, in that case, trustees are going to take a higher role
yeah.
and in that because they have a deeper responsibility. But everyone shares in that.
So how is it different from the corporation?
The corporation, the church itself, the INC, is the individual.
Okay. That's what I thought.
So being incorporated protects. That's a fiduciary responsibility to protect, which also means the church I'm at right now, we just went through the process. We're coming up on our 60th birthday. They had talked about it for years. We got the incorporation done on January 1. My former chair of finance celebrated. Here's why. Church had a credit card. It was a Visa card. This Visa card said Epworth United Methodist Church on it. But you know who signed for it and opened the account? Larry, who is the chair of finance. So guess what happens when the bill doesn't get paid?
Larry.
Goes on Larry's credit line, and it also goes against him in terms of all that. So I instructed the church as we got ready to incorporate that we should run the bill up, open a new Visa card, and just hand the statement to Larry. So being incorporated allows you to, as an entity, to enter into legal contracts that don't obligate an individual, but instead obligate the corporation. It will open up other opportunities to do that. But you have to maintain that, and oftentimes what's happened is you've created bylaws for your corporation, but you haven't created any of the records to maintain them, and you've allowed them to lapse, or you haven't kept it. You have to, as a corporation, you have to meet annually, you have to have elected officers, you have to go through all that in terms of that. Trustees, and there's that big in italics there, trustees in conjunction with the pastor. Not in spite of the pastor, in conjunction with the pastor, are responsible for how the building is used and how the grounds are used. That outside group that wants to come in, here's a real easy thing as trustees, set a building use policy. Do it in conjunction with your pastor, and then you don't have to argue over who's using the building. It makes it really easy with that. Maintain inventories. Set up a maintenance schedule. Be accountable to the charge conference and the church council. Whether you're doing it or not, or whether your church council chair is asking for it, submit a report from the trustees that reminds them of your long-term goals, your short-term goals, maintenance needs, and all of that. And keep it in front of the entire church council and all of that structure so that it's always being seen. The biggest piece the trustees forget is that they just don't have that open communication. And in that ad council structure, you've got the ability to submit that report consistently every time your church council meets, for that. Evaluate your insurance coverage. It's the one piece I've discovered in every church that I've served, that you fall in love with your carrier or your agent. And we just redid our insurance and saved, our premiums dropped with the same coverage by 35% in terms of that. I mean, that for us, that's a $6,000 savings. That's a whole new ministry program that was created by simply evaluating the insurance that was there.
And can I just say something to that real quick? We just reviewed our insurance, something that had not been done for a lengthy time, and I got kind of witchy and said we wanted to do this. We found out we've been paying for a ghost property for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And cannot recoup all of that money back.
Correct.
They went back on you. Yeah, so everybody just assumes that the person who was before them did it just fine.
So what I have you do is flip over. What I've provided you for there is just a sample. This is not, this did not come off the mountain, was not chiseled in stone. The only reason it's in ink is because it was printed. I wrote it in pencil. But you'll notice there are 4 quarters. Trustees, that's what you ought to be meeting at least quarterly. These are things that you ought to do. Here's the thing. Let's just pretend that we're the board of trustees. You do understand that these activities doesn't mean that you all have to do them. Maybe you have someone that you have access to and that is interested in this and said, hey, could I have you do this for us? We're going to be meeting in 2 months. Would you report back to us? It's okay to use people that have greater skill. So when we redid our insurance, we have a gentleman that's an insurance broker, and we gave one rule to him. We'd love for you to do this, but I'm not going to place my insurance with you. Therefore, it was open to anyone, larger church where I had multiple. But if you'll do this, here's the rule. You're not going to do it so it becomes self-serving in terms of that. They were like, no problem at all. What can we do? And we evaluated everything with it. Find the experts. And most, if we really believe the church is this, then the Bible promised us that every gift that we need in the church is sitting in our pews. We just have to go find it and acknowledge that maybe we're not the right expert, but we can have access to it. So that's just a sample calendar of activities and things that are good to look at over the course of a year. Which leads me to a story, and there's a reason for it. As you want to do, you want to get the young people involved, right? I had a young gentleman that was a part of the church. We were not at a single board structure. We had multiple committees. He worked as a contractor. He was in his late 20s, very gifted. Person said, I think Rob would be perfect to be on the board of trustees. Well, that makes sense. He's a contractor. He should be on the board of trustees. The board of trustees was working for the first 3 months of that year on rewriting and establishing building use policy, evaluating the insurance. They were doing a lot of airplane flying. They were up at high altitude. They met each month for the first 3 months of the year. After the third meeting, Rob comes to my office and says, trustees just isn't where I need to be. I want off. And what I discovered is that Rob wanted to be on the trustees because Rob liked to work with his hands. And the problem was he kept going to a meeting where they were working with their hands, but it was with a calculator and a pen and paper. And the end result of that is that Rob ended up at another church because they put him to work right away. The lesson I learned in that, because I know Rob and his family, and Rob still does work for me. He's a really good contractor. Is you need to get the right people, and Rob was one of the right people. He just was in the wrong role. Rob needed to be attached to the trustees, but he didn't need to be a trustee. Or the trustees needed to say, you know what, you don't need to be at this meeting. This would be better. We've got a sub-team that's going to do this work. But Rob, did you know we got a problem with the back door? It keeps sticking. Could you take a look at it this week when you got time? Because Rob loved to do that. He loved to do anything that he could do to put things together. Now, the proof that pastors can learn lessons, 3 years later, Chris showed up. Chris is a great contractor, married into the church, had never been in church his entire life. I didn't put him on a committee. I just got to know him and found out what he liked to do. And 6 months after he had been at the church, Chris took charge of completely remodeling the children's wing and did it all because he wanted to do something and tore stuff apart, built it, did all those types of things. Doesn't want to have, he'll tell you, I don't want to be on a committee, but if you want me to do something, just ask me. Right people in right roles. And I've said this for a long period of time. Just because you're a banker doesn't mean you should be on the finance committee. Maybe your gift is in the nursery bouncing babies on your knee. Don't assume that what you get paid to do during the week is what you want to come do when you get to the church. Does that make sense? Find the right role for the right people. That's a big shift in that. So, next steps. Next steps are this. What's the bigger picture for the role of the trustee in the church? I think there's 3 things that you really have to look at to be careful in the 21st century. One is liability and exposure. Insurance is important, but it's also about due diligence, because just having insurance isn't going to cover you. In other words, you can't say we didn't know. That's not a legal case. You don't get to go before a judge and go, oh, I didn't know, and they go, oh, you didn't know, case dismissed. You have remember that big word, fiduciary? You have a fiduciary role and obligation, and part of that, insurance will help you with that. Because insurance isn't interested in giving you $5 million worth of coverage without making sure that you've provided the due diligence that means we're never going to have to pay you $5 million. You see, it's that relationship that's there. So they can help you, whatever that insurance company is, they're going to help you go through those audit checklists in terms of that. So insurance can be a big tool, not to be afraid of, but to embrace. That's why you do those annual audits or set out to do a review every couple of years, because it's going to help you see things that you wouldn't have otherwise seen. The other piece of that is whether you are already incorporated or are not, you need to go back as a trustee and examine those documents to make sure that you're even meeting the obligation of the corporation. In other words, if you go back and can't find the minutes of your last corporation meeting, you're not a corporation, because you're not meeting the first test. Did you act like a corporation? So go back and review those things. The second piece, which is sort of related to liability and exposure, but it's more about stewardship from my perspective. Do you have a policy for endowments, estate gifts, people that are leaving you, whether it be life insurance or a gift that's coming out of someone's estate? If you don't have a policy of how to address those gifts, Lord help you on the day that it comes.
Who makes that? Trustees?
The trustees.
Not stewardship.
No, and it's specifically, here's where you get the permission. If you go to the Book of Discipline and you want to create an endowment or you want to create a policy for gift acceptance, the Book of Discipline explicitly states that that role exists in trustees. Now there's a process. So if you don't have an endowment, the process, if I'm trying to remember this correctly, is church council says we think having an endowment would be really good. Guess who has the power, authority, and is the only power and authority that can create the endowment?
Okay.
The trustees.
And that's-
Legally, any estate gift goes to the trustees. And the trustees are the ones that have to determine how it's going to be used. Now, if you want to go talk to the foundation can help you with that, but the foundation can tell you the horror stories of churches that were completely divided because somebody left them $500,000 and they didn't know what to do with it. But I'll guarantee you somebody in one of these has an idea, and somebody else over here has an idea, and before you know it, it looks like this. And they're not together. The other piece of it is, if that estate left you a sailboat, what are you going to do with it? And here's the problem with it, right? You better have a policy that tells you what what gifts are acceptable. Because I can tell you, I've got friends that are down in Florida. There's a church down there that was left a really nice boat that was worth almost $250,000. And the church didn't have any policy that, other than the trustees said, "That's awesome, let's get it and sell it." Took them 5 years to sell it, and after it was sold with all the fees, costs, and expense, the church lost $75,000. Wasn't that a wonderful gift? And you know what? If they had a gift acceptance policy, you know what the gift acceptance policy would have said? When you sell the boat, we'll be more than happy to receive the proceeds, but we won't take real property. The previous church I was at in Hagerstown, Indiana, world headquarters for Perfect Circle, did piston rings. World War II, not one piston ring failure in any plane, Jeep, tank, anything. Gold star. That little tiny town of 2,000 people has things that no town of 2,000 people, because that company built that town. It's the true definition of a corporate town. Here's the problem. They were sold to Dana Corporation, which is a global company, and Perfect Circle, which was a division of it, went bankrupt. And the stock in Dana Corporation that was attached to the original Perfect Circle is worth this. Except for 25 years ago, a woman left $200,000 worth of stock in Dana Corporation to the church. And the restrictions of the estate gift were that they be only used based on the dividends paid, because it was a high dividend paying stock. By the time they could get through the legal wrangling in order to liquidate the stock that had been given to them, because they didn't have an endowment, they didn't have a gift acceptance policy, they sold the stock for $32,000.
Oh.
That did not honor the individual that left the gift. And the reason it didn't is because no one had taken the trustee's role to be a steward and set up those things. So endowments, estate, all those types of things, just simply putting together a policy of how gifts are accepted. And your foundation, they got a nice little table upstairs, they can help you with that. The third piece is that you can do the work of is building use policies. Establish how your building is used. Start with outside groups, because everyone has an idea of how outside groups should be treated, and then you'll discover you already have the policy for your inside groups. They just won't like it when it gets applied to them. But I mean, you have them. Do you have a policy of how weddings are conducted? How about when your scouts, if you've got scout troops or civic groups that come into the building, those need to be reviewed and looked at so that you understand what that looks like. Because guess what? If something happens at one of those events, guess who they want to know? Trustees. What was the policy? What do you mean they couldn't do that? Here's a pastor. My building use policy for weddings, it's very specific about photographers. And we go over that because it's in writing. So therefore, it's not my policy. It's the building use policy that's been dictated by the trustees. Because if you spend any time talking to your pastor about weddings, they will tell you that it should be a day of celebration, and instead it is the biggest pain. Outside wedding coordinators, all of this. I have a real simple rule. You see that back door? That's the door to the sanctuary. Your job stops and starts at that door. Because when they walk into my sanctuary, I don't care. I tell this to my brides. On the wedding, at wedding rehearsal, everybody has an opinion. And guess what? I don't care. Because you and I, we've already made all the plans. And I'll play the bad guy. Thank you, Aunt Mabel from Florida. But we've already planned all of this. And it doesn't matter that you think that she should do this. Building use policy will help your pastor, and it will help those outside groups understand how to navigate being able to use the building. And the reason you're doing it is not to be mean, evil. You're not doing it to be the evil empire. You're doing it because you want to be welcoming and hospitable to those people. And how much easier it is to be welcoming and hospitable if you've set the ground rules and said, this is what you can do.
One of our issues with that was we had issues that the policies weren't being enforced, and when our new pastor came, he started enforcing policies, well, they all came back on us, and we never did this before. We had to say, it's right there in writing.
Yeah, and so that becomes that piece that you're always keeping those in front in terms of those annual things. Get the right people on the team. Just always remember Rob. Rob had the right heart, had the right skills, just was put in the wrong place. Last little bits here. I knew we were sprinting. Remember to facilitate your work by dividing it up. It doesn't mean everything has to be done just by a trustee. It's okay to have subgroups. It's okay to have people that have teams of responsibility. And if you've given them the responsibility and the authority, let them get it done with that. For those of you that are on single boards, if you haven't already, create a building and grounds team that is made up of doers. Because your single board are planners. They have to look at the real big picture. And as when you put on that trustee hat, when you're in that single board meeting, you do need to make sure that the insurance gets reviewed and the building policy. But it's okay to create a team that looks at that. But the last thing, if you have a single board structure and every meeting is about the list of what needs to be repaired, you're never going to get anything else done. And so the biggest lesson that I've learned with single boards is to create a building and grounds team. And guess what? It's not an official, it's a team. It's not a committee, which means they get together when they want to get together. They talk about what needs to be done, and that group of men and women, they come in whenever. They have a list of stuff, and they're all tied together by email. And they always copy me on it. And I'll get an email that says, I'm going to be at the church Wednesday night doing this. If anybody wants to join me, and I'll look around, and 3 or 4 of them have showed up, and they're working on something, and they're happy. They don't want to be on a committee. They love doing that. And so That can also be a lesson even for trustees in a church council model to create a building and grounds team which would have a whole bunch of Robs on them. The doers, the people that want to do those types of things. Create an emergency fund. A trustees emergency capital fund. Restrict it that way. Let finance committee manage it. It's always good to throw them a bone, right? But ensure that you have available to you the funds that you need to do repairs. The church I'm currently at, well, the last two churches, I was so thankful that we had those types of funds. Last fall, the church I'm at is in the city of Indianapolis, but most of our parking lot is in the 100-year floodplain. And because of that, I always wondered what this thing was, but we have a pump station because we sit lower than city sewers, so we actually are responsible for maintaining a pump station that lifts our sewage from the church up into the city sewer system. So guess what went out last fall?
The sewer system.
The pump lift station. And the repair?
$4,500.
$17,000. What we discovered was it had been there for 60 years. And there's no record of any maintenance or upkeep that had ever been done on it. We now have a maintenance program on it because we invested $17,000 on 2 new pumps. We also learned that the system that was in there had a primary pump and a backup pump.
Oh, well, there you go.
But here's the problem. The backup pump never ran because as long as the primary pump operated, everything was fine. So guess what happened when the primary pump went out?
Yeah.
Nobody knew that the backup pump had been gone for years. So we installed a new system, and guess what the new system does? It rotates. It's a balanced system that operates both pumps, but it has a backup on it. Do you know what it's like as a pastor to be told that the repair is $17,000? Exactly. And except for the conversation was, but we're okay because we've got those funds in our capital account for doing repairs, and we're just going to release the repair from there. And so it didn't hit our budget. It didn't break us or cause us at the end of the summer to reevaluate what we were going to do in the last quarter in terms of that. Once you've established those policies and procedures, follow them. Because if you follow them, you'll find that your expenses and your control boundaries exist for a reason. And when people know that a policy exists for a reason, they're far